Support for this episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And also by the generous support of listeners like you who choose to support us at Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/trifles. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, there were men that were dancing, creeping, and crooked, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? What's a tantalus? Or a gasogene? And what's the difference between a hansom cab and a four-wheeler?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 317, A Detective by Any Other Name. Well, hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the details about the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, I'm surprised you're going by your traditional name. I would have thought you'd be going by an alias today.
By an alias? Oh, Crazy Legs is a good one. I like that.
Crazy Legs.
I've always wished somebody would call me Crazy Legs, and no one ever has.
Well, your legs are pretty sensible, if you ask me.
Well, see, that's part of the problem.
It's the rest of you I wonder about.
Did you ever have a nickname over the years?
Yeah. With my last consultancy, I actually was the one who instigated the nicknames for all of our principals. We had a Texan, kind of the cowboy type, who was always late to every meeting we had, without fail. And I nicknamed him Pokey, which is good. And then we had another one who his hair had turned prematurely white. He's a little older than us, very wise. And his particular area of expertise outside of consulting was in pop music of the last 50 years. And so his nickname was Pops.
Oh, okay.
And then they were having trouble coming up with a nickname for me, although I did come from the automotive industry just previous. And during one New York excursion, I hopped on an electric scooter and, well, let's just say the scooter took off without me. So my nickname became Wheels.
Oh, Wheels. I would have thought it would have been Scooter. Scooter's a good name.
It's close. It would have been either one. But Wheels was more universally acceptable, regardless of what transport mechanism we were taking. So
yeah, maybe it indicates the community of consultants you were part of were not as creative, perhaps, as
we were
others.
not. We were not creative at all. So, well, we're not here to talk about that kind of consulting. We're here to talk about another kind of consulting altogether. But before we do that, let's remind everyone that the show notes are available at ihose.co/trifles317, all lowercase, ihose.co/trifles317. That'll take you to the SherlockHolmesPodcast.com website, where you can sign up for email updates and also sign up as a Patreon supporter. We have a wonderful mug available to our Patreon supporters at a certain level. Why don't you check that out and see what works for you, and we can get you a Trifles mug through the post service. And, of course, we are at I Hear of Sherlock across all of our social media accounts, which also accounts for our other Sherlock Holmes podcast, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. Check that out as well if you want to hear interviews with people who are doing neat and creative things in the world of Sherlock Holmes. Well, this is an interesting Trifles episode because it is in fact influenced by a publication called Trifles, Every year at the BSI dinner, Bill Hyder, BSI, who is from the Baltimore area, has a little piece of blue cardstock that he includes in the dinner handout, and it's called "There's Nothing So Important as Trifles." And this year, his trifle was all about the term detective and consulting detective. And this is interesting because Watson and Holmes each have different ways of referring to Sherlock Holmes. And in fact, the other police force that we encounter have different ways of referring to Sherlock Holmes, and he to them. So it's kind of a trifling discussion about detection that we're going to have today and its various forms. So why don't we begin at the beginning when Watson's trying to figure out what it is that Sherlock Holmes does. There's a wonderful exchange they have in A Study in Scarlet. And Holmes describes what he does for his, quote, bread and cheese. He said, "I have a trade of my own. I suppose I am the only one in the world. I'm a consulting detective, if you can understand what that is. Here in London, we have lots of government detectives and lots of private ones. When these fellows are at fault, they come to me, and I manage to put them on the right scent. They lay all of the evidence before me, and I'm generally able, with the help of my knowledge of the history of crime, to set them straight."
You know, it's interesting listening to that, though. Holmes draws a clear distinction. So we now have three categories. We now have three sort of boxes on the stage. We have government detectives, we have private detectives. But no, Holmes just said, I'm a consulting detective. So when these fellows run into difficulty, they come to me, I advise them. And yet, in the cases of Sherlock Holmes, and indeed in that very case, A Study in Scarlet, Holmes is really anything but a consulting detective. He is a detective because he does the actual work.
Well, this is interesting because what it presents is someone at the beginning of his career. Remember, he and Watson met in 1881. His practice was just beginning to get off the ground. He was looking for someone to share rooms with, right? So clearly he wasn't doing extraordinarily well financially yet. And wouldn't it be easier, when you think about the world of detection, wouldn't it be easier to network and get to know these other kinds of detectives who are a smaller group than, say, the general public, and advertising your services for the general public, who have no idea who you are or what differentiates you? So in some ways, it was really kind of a stepwise fashion of Holmes getting to where he eventually did by, instead of, if we can turn this to business speak for a minute, he was doing business-to-business consulting rather than business-to-consumer. B2B versus B2C, as we say.
I say, Holmes, what's your value prop? I beg your pardon, Watson, did you say something?
Well, everyone needs a mission statement, Holmes.
I have a vision, Watson. Well, Holmes, sit down and stay away from the cocaine.
You've been at the devil's foot route again, I see.
Oh, dear.
Yeah, but he's very clearly not a traditional detective. Government detective is how I think he would refer to the police force. And even later, and this is in the same story in A Study in Scarlet. He says, who is he speaking to here? This was when John Rance, who was one of the, I think he
Constable.
was Constable Rance. He sprang to his feet with a frightened face and suspicion in his eyes. "Where did you see all that? It seems to me you know a good deal more than you should." Holmes laughed and threw his card across the table to the constable. "Don't get arresting me for the murder," he said. "I am one of the hounds and not the wolf." Mr. Gregson and Mr. Lestrade will answer for that. So he says, I'm one of the hounds, which could be a synonym for detective. But interesting in that construction, I am one of the hounds and not the wolf. He's saying he's on the right side of the law rather than the criminal side. You could also read it as if he were saying that he is a consultant, not a detective inspector.
Well, maybe, but he clearly is identifying. I mean, this is obviously a fox hunting analogy, and he's identifying himself with the pursuers rather than the pursued. So, but it's interesting. One thing that is interesting, we should locate this too for our listeners. After all, we're talking about a period in the last quarter of the 19th century. And what happened there was a huge expansion because of the empire in the number of people in Britain and Europe who were described as members of a profession. So the empire is expanding, the state is growing, and there's a demand now for lawyers and doctors and members of the clergy and teachers, but there's also a demand for new service providers. So now you have accountants, you have bankers, you have civil engineers, professions, that were not really in the list of professions decades earlier. And so there's a lot of movement and the emergence of a middle class in society. And so against that backdrop, Holmes, creating a new profession, it does make a lot of sense, particularly, at the point in which he introduces himself as this consulting detective.
Yeah, and when we think about the people that he's working with, clearly they're struggling. They don't really have any kind of, well, at least we don't understand them to have any kind of standard practice. They seem to be bumblers. As a matter of fact, when we hear about Lestrade and Gregson, Holmes does provide them a compliment. He says they're the pick of a bad lot. Which kind of gives you a sense as to his estimation of the police force overall. But let's recall, when we think about the hierarchy of the police force there were constables, a detective constable, detective sergeant, detective inspector, detective chief inspector, detective superintendent, detective chief superintendent, assistant chief constable, deputy chief constable, and chief constable, right? So there's a very orderly hierarchy there. And constables and sergeants, they're feet on the street, basically. And inspectors would have been those constables and sergeants who had served enough time and hopefully kept their nose out of trouble and been promoted. There's no indication that there was some sort of professional development plan or a schooling or process that they went through to give them skills that were different than a sergeant or a constable before them might have had.
Well, no, that's absolutely true. And if you look at the etymology of the word detective, and you consult the Oxford English Dictionary, as we always do, you find that the earliest reference, and it's interesting, is 1843, having the character or function of detecting, serving to detect, employed for the purpose of detection. In Chambers' Journal in 1843, the quotation is, "Intelligent men have been recently selected to form a body called the detective police. At times, the detective policeman attires himself in the dress of ordinary individuals." And now that's interesting for a number of reasons. One is that when you look at the word detective, it's frequently associated with Poe and Murders in the Rue Morgue. But that was published in 1841, before the word detective was in common use. And indeed, this Chambers Journal reference is for 2 years after that. So the idea that Poe, who created the mystery story, undoubtedly, but it really can't be said Poe coined the word detective, I don't think. And this was, as we were talking earlier, a difficult time for detectives because of their working conditions.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, detectives in those eras, or in that era, I should say, they were responsible for their own expenses as they, hunted about for the criminal, followed up on clues, etc., which may have taken them abroad in some cases. They had to take care of that financial outlay on their own, and were not necessarily guaranteed of compensation for that. And they worked 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. I mean, there's no rest for the law in this case.
No, until I notice the passing of the Weekly Rest Day Act of 1910. Good grief.
Wow. Well, how appropriately named.
Yeah. How about that?
Yeah. Well, and we'll have a link to this, to more detail about the background of the life of a Victorian detective in our show notes. Take a look for that. But why don't we pause for just a moment and consider the life outside of the detective? Well, Bert, I know you, like I, are a subscriber to the Baker Street Journal. And that means you get 4 quarterly issues a year. But there's also a bonus issue that every subscriber gets. It's called the Christmas Annual. Tradition started in, back in the 1950s by Sherlockians outside of the Baker Street Journal who created their own annuals. And I think it was in 1956 or so that the BSJ started this. And it was re-energized in 1998 after laying fallow for a good 3 decades. But the reason I mention it is because, have you seen the latest Christmas Annual, Bert?
It's fabulous, it really is. And in fact, this is getting out ahead. I've been meaning to send a note to Sonia Featherston and Julie McCurris because this Christmas Annual deals with the forgotten women of the Baker Street Irregulars, all those women who participated in the Sherlockian world and were known to the Irregulars and who made contributions, important contributions, before women were finally admitted into the society in the 1980s by Tom Stix. And it really is, it's beautifully written and beautifully laid out. It's just a really joy to have that annual. Nice
It
work.
is. And there's, usual names you would expect to see in there, but a bunch of others that come to light. I mean, we've got Carolyn Wells and Esther Longfellow and, of course, Edith Meiser. But how about Gypsy Rose Lee? Well, there's an interesting surprise for people who might not be familiar with our little corner of the world. The famous burlesque dancer that she, in fact, was associated with the early Sherlockians there. Well, there's so much to consume in this particular issue of the Baker Street Journal Christmas Annual. Why don't you make sure that you don't miss out on your opportunity to get the next Christmas Annual by taking out a subscription to the Baker Street Journal? Just go to bakerstreetirregulars.com and sign up today. Well, we're back and talking about the notion of a detective in Victorian times, and specifically Sherlock Holmes calling himself a consulting detective. And as I said, this is inspired by a piece from the BSI dinner packet this year from Bill Hyder. He says Holmes was given several other professional titles by himself in conversation and by Dr. Watson in print. Some of those other terms are investigator, criminal investigator, which he used in the Hound of the Baskervilles, criminal agent, which he used in the Red-Headed League and the Empty House, private agent, well, there's an interesting one, in the Devil's Foot. Now, Bert, you are probably, well, between the two of us, you are the foremost expert on the Devil's Foot. Do you remember Holmes referring to himself as a private agent in that exchange, or Watson referring to him as a private agent?
Oh, I do.
I think it's in the early paragraphs. He said, in March of that year, Dr. Moore Agar of Harley Street.
Oh, right.
Whose dramatic introduction to Holmes, I may someday recount, gave positive injunctions that the famous private agent lay aside all his cases and surrender himself to complete rest. Oh.
Yeah, that is interesting. This euphemism for consulting detective is private agent.
Agent, yeah. Well, Holmes did say, and this would have been in a story around about that time in the Sussex Vampire, he said, this agency remains flat-footed on the ground. So agency, understandable there, but not referring to himself as a detective.
And Bill Hyder's contribution here to the dinner packet sort of lists all of these various references. He's occasionally an investigator, a criminal investigator, both in the Hound of the Baskervilles, criminal agent in the Red-Headed League and the Empty House, private agent, as you say, in the Devil's Foot, independent investigator in the Valley of Fear, and one of my favorites, the most incisive reasoner and the most energetic agent in Europe in A Scandal in Bohemia.
Incisive reasoner and most energetic agent in Europe. Huh. Now, this is interesting because when I hear most energetic agent in Europe, it makes me think about that list of spies that Mycroft shared with Holmes in the Bruce Partington plans as foreign agents. So they're not a detecting agent, but a foreign agent.
Isn't that interesting?
Secret
and then Bill Hyder
agent.
goes on to say, in The Missing Three-Quarter, Holmes announces himself as a private detective. Something from the start of this conversation in A Study in Scarlet that Holmes had disclaimed. That's not me. There are government agents and there are private detectives, but I am a consulting detective.
Well, and that's interesting because do you think by the time The Missing Three-Quarter rolled around that Holmes could easily be identified as a private detective?
Well, The Missing Three-Quarter was a case from December of 1896, if you pay attention to the chronologies. And, I would think so. But I think also the novelty of the profession clearly had faded from this early 1880 mention of being a consulting detective. And now, it was much more commonplace, this idea.
Well, that does make sense. I mean, it's certainly part of the parlance. And I mean, when we think about Sherlock Holmes, and you ask a child even, or you hold up a silhouette of Sherlock Holmes with the famous pipe and the deerstalker, and we all know about the history of those. But when you hold up this silhouette, it's almost universally recognized from everywhere from children to adults. You say, what does this mean? And invariably they will say, well, that means detective. Sherlock Holmes was a detective. No one deigns to call him a consulting detective or a consultant or an agent. He is certainly a detective. And a detective who is not part of the police force. That part is very clear. Holmes always ensures that people know he is not retained by the police to supply their deficiencies. He is independent.
Well, it is fairly obvious. If you're with someone and they immediately or eventually hurl themselves prone on the carpet in front of you and whip out a magnifying glass and begin studying the fibers, and it's in the 19th century and not the 20th century, so they're not looking for a contact lens, then really they must be a detective.
I can't tell you how many times that's happened to me. I'm just sitting there enjoying a nice cup of tea or coffee with a friend, and they hurl themselves down on the floor.
Yeah, your barber has asked me to ask you not to do that anymore.
Bill continues his short piece by saying, it's a curious fact that while Dr. Watson frequently applied the term detective to police officers like Gregson and Lestrade, Holmes, after speaking of these quote-unquote government detectives in A Study in Scarlet, he never referred to them as government detectives again. And at the same time, no policeman ever referred to Sherlock Holmes as a detective. And it doesn't take a detective to know that this is the last episode of the month of January. And for those unfamiliar, at the end of every month, we do a drawing just for our Patreon supporters. And we do another drawing at the end of every quarter as well, just for our Patreon supporters. The monthly drawing means that you could win a back copy of the Baker Street Journal. And the quarterly drawing means you could win an annual subscription to the Baker Street Journal. So this is the drawing for a back issue of the BSJ. Let's bring out the prize wheel and give it a spin. All right, here it goes. Landing on number 9, randomly chosen from our subscriber list. That is Joe Wynn. Joe, you win. How do you like that? Well, Joe, we will send you a back issue of the Baker Street Journal. And just so you know, Patreon members, Patreon supporters are all eligible to win throughout the year. We will only allow you to win once for any given category. So, Joe, you've won your back issue for the year. We do appreciate your support continued, but you are still eligible for the Baker Street Journal subscription drawing as well. We just want to make sure everyone has a fair chance to win big prizes. What do you make of that?
Oh, it's just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes. That is why I've chosen my own profession, or rather, created it. For I am the only one in the world.
The only unofficial detective.
The only unofficial consulting detective.